Have you ever been confused when you hear people talking about speakers and you hear words like spider or basket or biomimetic suspension system and wondered what the heck are they talking about? Well, this video is for you. I am AV Obsessed, and if you're watching this video on my channel, that means that you probably are too. And today I am going to be doing anatomy of a speaker. In this video, I'm going to be taking apart a fully working speaker and showing you all the different parts that make up a speaker and what all the different functions of those parts are. And I will actually be ripping apart a functioning speaker driver so I can show you what's going on the inside of a speaker driver, show you the parts that you can't see by me just holding one up. So make sure you stick around. Now that the intro is out of the way, I'm going to call this section 1, the outside of the speaker. So the main thing obviously on the outside of the speaker is known as the cabinet. Like a lot of people will call it a speaker box as well, but you know, the nicer term is the speaker cabinet. And the speaker cabinet is super important for sound quality because if you buy a speaker that's built out of like really thin, like some of the really cheap speakers out there are made out of like 1/2 inch thick MDF. Most of the better quality speakers are 3/4 inch MDF, and then some of the really nice stuff is HDF. And if you don't know what MDF and HDF is, it's medium density fiberboard versus high density fiberboard. The high density fiberboard tends to resonate less. The whole goal with a speaker cabinet is you don't want the speaker cabinet to impart any sound into the signal. So cross bracing is very important. It's funny because I think when I was reviewing the ELAC DB63s and I knocked on the side of the speaker and I said that they passed the knock test, I had a comment in that video where someone like said basically, oh, the knock test, what a load of garbage or something like that. It's like, no, there's actually a lot of legitimacy to it because if you knock on the side of a speaker and you can hear a lot of ringing and like it feels cheap. Like if you knock on it, it feels like you're knocking on the front of your kitchen cabinets. That's not a good sign. It's probably not going to sound very good, no matter how good of quality of speaker drivers and crossover you put into the cabinet. If you build the cabinet out of really cheap wood without very much bracing inside, it's not going to sound very good. So going over the various parts of the speaker cabinet, we're going to start at the front of the cabinet, which if you ever hear someone say the word baffle, that is the front part of the speaker cabinet. Where they mount the speaker drivers to is called the front baffle or the baffle of the speaker. And the front baffle of the speaker is probably the most important component of the speaker cabinet because if they make the front baffle out of thin, cheap wood and the speaker drivers can sit there and vibrate the front baffle, especially like if your woofer is vibrating enough to impart some of its vibrations into the tweeter, that's going to distort the sound. It's going to mess things up. So the front baffle is probably the most important part of the speaker cabinet. And then just on this particular speaker, it is a horn-loaded speaker. A horn is a type of what they call waveguide, and a lot of speakers have waveguides, like not necessarily deep enough to be considered a horn, but essentially the purpose of the waveguide is to control directivity of the tweeter, because a tweeter is usually about a 1/2 a circle dome, and if you mount that on the front baffle of the speaker, like flush mounted to the front baffle, essentially the tweeter is going to impart sound out into your room in a 180-degree fashion. And some speaker designs that works really well, but other speaker designs it doesn't. And also it comes down to preference as well. Speakers like this with a horn tend to have a little bit narrower of a dispersion pattern, which means a narrower sweet spot and not quite as big a imaging. But it gives you a more forward and direct sound. Like a lot of times you hear people talk about Klipsch speakers and they say that it sounds like you're, you know, in the front row of a concert or something like that. That's the sound that they go for, and it's mostly preference. But other speakers like the SVS Ultra Evolution Pinnacle that I reviewed a while ago. That tweeter is mounted just flat on the baffle, and those speakers just have a huge soundstage, great imaging. Honestly, that's kind of my preference, but some people like the horn style as well. But yeah, horns and waveguides, essentially the same thing. It just kind of depends on how shallow or deep the waveguide is, what determines whether it's a horn or if it's just a waveguide. And then on this particular one, this is a nice soft rubber that actually peels out pretty easily, and then you can take screws out to pull the whole horn and everything out of the speaker. And then down below, around the woofer on this speaker, they have this trim ring right here that is essentially there to cover up all the screws that hold the woofer in place, but it also has this nice smooth edge that is supposed to help with edge diffraction, so you don't get, you know, the speaker creating sound frequencies that are going to bounce off of this edge and interfere with things and cause cancellations at different angles and different frequencies. Now coming around to the back of the speaker. Now there's not a whole lot going on in the back. It's usually just the speaker terminals and the port. But on this particular speaker, the port is a little different than most designs because I feel like they just kind of wanted to mimic the look of the horn on the front of the speaker. So they gave it this rectangular Tractrix horn style port. But it does the exact same thing as the port on any speaker does. Essentially, the whole point of the port is to allow the air pressure that is generated from your woofer moving back and forth to be able to escape the speaker. And essentially it makes it so that your woofer can move back and forth more freely. Usually it makes speakers play quite a bit deeper than if they were sealed. Most bookshelf speakers these days are doing a rear port. Something very important is getting this flared edge right. Like this has a nice wide flared edge, and actually I have the other speaker all taken apart already, so I'll show you the port. They flared the outside and the inside, which is super important because if you don't flare this edge as the air is moving back and forth, if it's not a smooth airflow, you'll get, if you've ever heard the term chuffing, you'll get a lot of port chuffing if you don't round this edge really well. So Klipsch did a pretty good job on this. I don't think I've ever heard any port chuffing coming from these speakers. If they would have just, you know, had this be a sharp like 90-degree turn, then there would be noise from the air flowing in and out of the speaker, and that's distracting and annoying. Most annoying and distracting in a subwoofer, because a subwoofer moves a lot of air, so you could usually hear a lot of port chuffing on subwoofers where the port isn't super well designed. So yeah, that's enough talk about the speaker port. And then at the bottom here, these are the speaker terminals. So this particular speaker has 4 speaker terminals, 2 positives, 2 negatives. One pair is high level. So if you remove the little bridges, I'll flip this upside down. That'll make it easier to talk about these. If you remove these little wire bridges that go from positive to positive and from negative to negative, you can bi-amp these speakers. And bi-amping essentially means that you're running one amplifier to power the tweeters and one amplifier to power the woofers. On a speaker like this, I suspect there's not too many people running a bi-amp system for, you know, a pair of like $500 or $600 bookshelf speakers. But it's kind of nice that they give you the option. It's a little excessive, but you know, it probably costs them an extra 50 cents to put an extra pair of binding posts on the back of the speaker. And binding posts like this, they're actually pretty nice because they support bare wire, they support spades, which is what these connections are. These are spade connectors, so they call it a spade because, I mean, it's not really a spade. Like a spade would look like a shovel, but that's what they call these. This is called a spade connector. They should call it a horseshoe connector, but these speaker terminals support bare wire, so you can unscrew that. You stick the bare wire through a little hole in the the threaded terminal there, and then you screw that back down and it clamps down on the wire and you're good. Otherwise, if you have spades like these, you unscrew it, you put the spade around the threaded post, and then you screw it down and you're good. And then my favorite way to connect a speaker is banana plugs, because banana plugs, you don't have to unscrew and rescrew this part of the speaker terminal at all. You just shove the banana plug right in the hole and you're good to go. So that is all that's going on the back of the speaker. And then on the bottom of this particular speaker, they give you this nice little cork pad. So if you set this thing on like a piece of furniture or something like that, it's not going to scratch it up, and it gives the speaker a little tiny bit of isolation from whatever surface you set it on. And then just to throw this one into the mix so you can see what a slightly different design looks like, this is the Focal Vestia number 1. This speaker, very similar, where it's got the tweeter up here, the woofer down here, but instead of having the port on the back, this speaker has the port on the bottom. So with these, if you have an extremely small space and you don't want to have your speakers like a foot and a half, 2 feet out into the room, these speakers, since the port isn't on the back, you can put these 4-6 inches away from the front wall, and you're still not going to get like too bad of like boomy, overpowering bass. So if you are looking for a speaker that's going to work really well in a small room, and you're very averse to having like over boomy bass, I would look at trying to get a speaker that has a front port like this. And then another thing that's different about this speaker versus that Klipsch that I was showing you is the fact that this one just has a single set of speaker terminals on the back. So no amping or no bi-amping or bi-wiring this type of speaker. But other than that, it's pretty similar. They put some nice glossy black side panels on it to dress it up a little bit, and this faux leather wrap that goes all the way around the front and bottom and top and back. But yeah, still a pretty similar design. And now we can start getting into the internal components of the speaker. I mean, I'll just mention the external components. This is that trim ring that goes around the woofer, essentially just pushes into the cabinet and covers up the screw holes and gives you this nice little transition area from the woofer to the cabinet so that it has a smoother frequency response. And this is that rubbery part of the waveguide or the horn that I was talking about earlier that just pulls right out. So yeah, this is a nice non-resonant piece of material so that the tweeter sound isn't colored by the horn too much. But here, we'll grab the empty speaker cabinet now. So this is the speaker cabinet with everything removed except for the internal padding. So front baffle here, it's actually a doubled up piece. So most of the speaker cabinet feels like it's made out of 3/4 inch MDF. It might be 5/8. But then the front is actually doubled up. So the front baffle, like I was talking about needing to be extremely well built, Klipsch did a pretty good job with that by doubling up the front baffle. On the inside of the speaker, I'll probably put this way up front here like this. You guys can see me through the hole where the port used to be. But you've got some point-to-point bracing going from one side to the other. This is just to make it so that you notice how it doesn't like ring for an incredibly long period of time. If this point-to-point brace wasn't here, if I tapped on the side of the speaker, you'd probably hear quite a bit of ringing essentially in the cabinet. So bracing is a good thing. And then on the inside, you'd see it's got this like cotton wadding, and that's another thing that contributes to not hearing the cabinet like ringing when you knock on the side of it. And the reason I knock on the side of it is because that is, you know, similar to if there was a quick transient bass like boom, that if the speaker cabinet wasn't built well, you would hear that resonating in the speaker cabinet, and that's distracting and it's ugly sound that you don't want to hear. So Speaker cabinet, very important to frequency response and sound quality. And the padding that they use inside here, it's basically the most basic version of it. There's also different materials that companies use, like foam, and egg crate foam works really, really well. Like when I restored my dad's Infinities, I put like the egg crate style foam inside of those to dampen the woofer cabinet. Now we can start talking about the most important parts of the speaker, the part that actually make the sound. So this is the woofer. Now I could probably do an entire video just on woofers, but we'll try to go over the basics with it pretty quickly here. The center part here is known as the center cap or the dust cap of the speaker. Its function, if you were to remove this, you would actually be able to see the voice coil inside of the speaker, and you'd be able to see the where the voice coil goes into what they call the magnet groove. And that wouldn't be good, because if anything gets in there, it's going to rub between the voice coil and the magnet, and as the speaker moves back and forth, you'd hear grinding and, you know, potentially short out the voice coil and blah, blah, blah. All sorts of bad stuff would happen. So that's a pretty important thing to have there. And then once you get past the little edge here where they glue the dust cap to the speaker cone, you have the speaker cone. This one happens to be aluminum. This is actually one of my pet peeves about Klipsch products, is the fact that they call this ceram-metallic. But what this is it's an aluminum cone, and then they coat it with like a couple of microns of ceramic material to try to reduce like resonance and stuff like that. It's aluminum though. It's aluminum with a very, very thin coat of ceramic material on it. But this gets into like a little bit of a thing about woofers and tweeters and everything, is the cone material. So the cone material is extremely important, but it is not like the end all and be all of speaker design. Like, you can have extremely high end, extremely good sounding paper cone woofers. So if you are looking at one speaker that has a paper cone and one speaker that has a carbon fiber cone, it doesn't necessarily mean that the carbon fiber one is going to be the better speaker just because it's using a more advanced material for the speaker cone. It can make a big difference, but it doesn't, just because one speaker has one material and one speaker has another doesn't mean that it's going to be better. So that's a quick little rant about the speaker material. Once you get beyond the cone, you see the black rubber surround here, and that is there to just make sure that in conjunction with the spider, the job of those two components is to make sure that the woofer cone and the voice coil can move back and forth perfectly straight, and they're not wobbling and coming out of alignment, because you don't want the voice coil rubbing on the inside of the magnet, because then you're just going to hear grinding and really bad sounds, and it's not going to sound the way that it's supposed to. That's actually one of the number one reasons that vintage speakers get thrown away, is because a lot of vintage speakers, they used a foam surround, and as the speakers age, that foam tends to essentially decompose and fall apart, and then the only thing that's holding the speaker cone and crossover in place is the spider, and so you don't have 2 points anymore of making sure that everything moves back and forth perfectly straight. So the woofer doesn't sound right anymore, it doesn't work right, and people will throw speakers away because of that. Most speakers these days are using this butyl rubber, which lasts for decades, if not centuries, hopefully that long. So speakers are going to probably last longer nowadays, which is cool, because most technology things aren't going that way. Like, they're lasting less and less time, not more and more time. But once you get beyond the surround, then you get to the basket. So this speaker has like the most standard, like basic version of a speaker basket. It's just a stamped steel basket. Nothing super wrong with that, especially because it's not like a big high-powered woofer. But there are other basket materials out there, like a lot of companies are using different types of plastic, which seems like that would be worse and cheaper, but it's actually, there's less resonance in plastic than in metal. So like a forged plastic type of basket is often the better type of material. And then like pretty much the best type of material is when they do a very heavy duty forged aluminum basket. That's what you see on a lot of the big higher end like subwoofer drivers and stuff like that. But the basket is essentially the chassis for the speaker. Everything is mounted to the basket. So you got the surround on this side glued to the speaker cone, and on this side you've got the surround glued to the speaker basket. And then the speaker basket goes all the way down and connects to the magnet. Now, the magnet structure is one of the most important parts of a speaker because without the magnet, there'd be no sound. I'll explain exactly how that works, how they actually work when I get to taking apart a speaker driver, but those are the basics for, me not tearing apart the speaker yet. Now we are going to dissect the tweeter of the RP-600M Series 2. But like I said, all of these tweeters and speakers work exactly the same way, except for if it's a planar magnetic or an electrostat or a field coil. If you guys want to know what those different things are, I mean, obviously you could Google it, or you could tell me in the comments that you want to see a video about those types of speakers. But this is essentially the full tweeter of the RP-600M Series 2. It's quite large here, but the only part of it that actually makes sound is this part. I'm going to set that aside for now. We are going to talk about the horn a little bit first. I actually am pretty impressed because I haven't taken this speaker apart before, like starting to make this video, but this is a very non-resonant horn because once you have this rubber material on here, it like just has the ability to absorb any resonance that would be caused by the hard plastic that the actual chassis of the horn is made out of. So this is where everything actually mounts to. The actual tweeter mounts back here, and then this mounts to the speaker cabinet. But without that rubber, like, it's a much more resonant sounding component. So that rubber that they put on there, not only does it make it look nicer because it covers up the screw holes and all that stuff, but it completely like gets rid of all the resonance sounds. But this is the actual part that makes sound. This is the only part of the tweeter that actually, makes the sound. So right here, I can just take it apart because I've already removed the screws, and we'll talk about this part first. This is the most important part of the tweeter. You're looking at the inside of the tweeter dome right now. This is something that most people never see because most people aren't like me in taking apart their speakers. Normally, all you see is the outside of the tweeter dome, but you guys get to see the inside of it on this video. And this little ring around the edge of it here is 100% the most important component of a speaker driver. That's the voice coil. So if you don't know what a voice coil is, essentially a voice coil is a copper wire that is wrapped around what's called a former. So the copper wire goes around the former. The former is essentially just a cylindrical piece of material. And some like really cheap speakers, it's cardboard. And then some of the really fancy speakers these days are using like carbon fiber and stuff like that. Sometimes it's aluminum, sometimes it's various types of plastic. But all it really is it's the material that they wrap the copper wire around. So the electricity can go in through one of these terminals, goes in through here, through the lead that goes from the terminal to the voice coil. And then the electricity goes around the former through that copper wire several times. And then it comes out and goes out through the negative line, and that, completes the circuit. So as your amplifier is pumping electricity into that voice coil, electricity, when it's wrapped around, or copper wire, when it's wrapped around something like that and you put electricity through it, it creates an electromagnet. So that little voice coil in there, as your amplifier is sending power to it, is generating an electromagnetic field that can essentially repel from or push in towards this, which is the actual like rare earth magnet. Now this particular one is a ferrite magnet. There are some companies these days using neodymium magnets, which give you a lot higher magnetism per pound essentially. But the only part of this that's actually magnet structure though is the black around the edge here. They put this is essentially just steel here to be essentially a structure for it, because ferrite is pretty brittle. So like trying to screw something like that into the ferrite, it would probably crumble pretty easily. So they make this nice metal structure that glues to the ferrite so that it'll hold it all together. And then they put a little bit of foam right in the center there. That way the waves coming off of the back of the inside of the tweeter dome are just going to get absorbed by this foam instead of bouncing off of the back of the inside of the magnet here and coming back and hitting the tweeter dome and causing interferences and stuff like that. And then the little tiny slot that goes around here, that is the voice coil slot or the magnet slot. So the voice coil sits inside of the magnet just a little bit on a tweeter, but on a woofer they can go, a couple of inches into the magnet. But on this one it maybe goes in like 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch into the magnet. So those are the basics of what the tweeter is and how it works. Now the only thing that's super different, and I kind of wish I could just pull this out so you could see the dome by itself, because it's got this big plastic structure around it on this particular one, but the only thing that's really different about this versus a surface mounted cone is normally you wouldn't have all this structure here. You would just see the tweeter dome, and they could mount that flush on the front of a speaker baffle, like when I was talking about the SVS Ultra Evolutions earlier. Their tweeter it would work in exactly the same way as this. It's just it's not going to be put into the back of a horn with all this stuff in front of it. It's just going to be a tweeter mounted on the front baffle. They put a little grill over it to protect it so that little kids don't poke and destroy it. But yeah, all dome tweeters pretty much work exactly the same way as this. And then last, but definitely not least, for the RP-600M here, you have the crossover. Now, this is, a pretty small crossover, but it's not as small as some speakers I've seen. Like when I took apart my KEF Q950, like the big, huge towers I had quite a while ago from KEF, but they're, essentially KEF's entry-level speakers. Their crossover was literally about the size of a credit card, and none of the components on it were anywhere near as big as these. So this, for the price point that Klipsch is offering these speakers at, is a pretty decent looking crossover. I'm sure that, what's that guy's name? The GR Research, Danny Ritchie from GR Research would probably, and he probably has pooped all over this crossover. But for the price, I would say that this is pretty decent. They're using some pretty decent little air core inductors here, but I'm not going to get super into all the technical parts of the crossover. That could definitely be its own video, and I'm pretty sure Danny Ritchie has made his own video on all of the different parts and what they do of a crossover. But what I will say is I believe the crossover is probably one of the most important and difficult components of a speaker to get right. The purpose of a crossover is, so these are the terminals that are on the back of the speaker. Electricity from your amplifier comes in from the terminals and goes into the crossover, and the crossover has, especially in a two-way speaker, it has two very important jobs. For one thing, it separates the bass and the treble so that it can go to the woofer and the tweeter. And then also it attenuates the volume, because a tweeter is typically much, much more efficient than a woofer. So if you don't know what efficiency means, it means like if 1 watt goes into a speaker driver, how many decibels come out? And the higher the decibels that come out at the same power, the more efficient that speaker driver is. And typically A horn tweeter like this tweeter, if you hooked it up all by itself with nothing in the way, like nothing like the crossover in the way, it's probably going to play over 100 decibels at 1 watt versus the woofer might be 90. So the crossover separates out the frequencies between the woofer and the tweeter so that the tweeter isn't trying to play notes that are too low for it to play, because a very small driver like that tweeter can't play low. So that's the main job of the crossover, and then also attenuating the volume so that the tweeter and the woofer are playing at approximately the same volume. Those are the two jobs of a crossover, and they need all these electrical components like inductors and capacitors and resistors to achieve that. That's the whole point of a crossover. Now, the reason I said it's probably one of the most important and difficult parts of speaker design is because it doesn't matter if you put the highest quality components, as in woofers and tweeters, into the most beautiful, well-built cabinet. If you don't get the crossover right, it's still gonna sound like crap. So that's why I say the crossover is the most important, or not the most important, but the most difficult part of speaker design to get right. Now, like I said earlier in the video, I'm gonna tear apart a speaker driver so you can see the actual inner components like the spider and stuff like that. But time for a bait and switch. I'm not gonna tear apart a nice woofer like this. That would be crazy. I am going to tear apart this little thing. This speaker driver came with my house, essentially. There were some tiny little plastic Sony speakers mounted in the back wall of the living room that probably came with a home theater and a box system that they bought in like the early 2000s. And so I'm gonna take this thing apart because it has no value. There is one thing that's a little different about this speaker than like the speaker drivers that are in the RP-600M. It has what they call video shielding around the magnet. So the reason that it has this is because back in the day of the CRT TVs, if you put a magnet too close to a CRT, the colors in the image would get all warped. And so they started putting this magnetic shielding around speaker drivers so that if you put one of these speakers really close, like if you had one on each side of your TV, it wouldn't screw up the picture. But this isn't common anymore because of the fact that LCDs and OLEDs and stuff like that don't care about magnets. So I am now going to tear apart this speaker driver so that you guys can see the inner components of it here. This surround is actually a little bit more durable of a material than I expected it to be, because this is a pretty decently sharp knife here. I know I'm using a big ridiculous knife for doing this, but that's the one I had easiest on hand to grab a hold of. So, oh, also another thing I could point out is this has the little dust cap that goes outwards instead of inwards on it. Like I was talking about how the inverted dust cap that they have on the RP-600M is the more common way to do it these days. This one is doing it the old-fashioned way, because these probably are from, like I said, like the early 2000s or maybe even the late 90s. So now I have cut all the way around the surround, or have I? Like this last little bit there. Even though this is just a completely like not valuable, like no value whatsoever speaker, it still kind of like pains me to do this because I like speakers so much. So right now all I'm doing is crumbling up the cone material, and then I'm gonna cut into the spider that holds it into the basket. Okay. Okay. Okay, so now You can see this is one of the leads. So the the internal terminals right here, and then this lead, until I just now ripped it out, used to go to the voice coil. And this material here, this little bit of material, this like accordion edged material, I don't know how well you guys can see that. That is what they call the spider. So the purpose of the spider is, you see now, this is a little bit, it's actually probably smaller in diameter but bigger in depth. This is the voice coil of this little Sony speaker here. But the whole point of the spider is essentially the spider glues to the throat of the voice coil and goes out and connects to the basket of the speaker. So the speaker cone is essentially suspended in two places. The surround on the outside of the cone that attaches to the basket, and then the spider connects to the throat of the voice coil and goes out and gets glued into the inside of the speaker basket. And it's usually like a fairly like heavy duty, like cloth feeling material. Like it's almost like a cross between cloth and paper. Actually, I wonder if I can rip this out. Oh yeah, I ripped out the whole spider. So that is the spider now that I've ripped it out. And usually, like I said, it's an accordion style material, and it's also kind of a hybrid feeling material. It feels kind of like paper and kind of like cloth at the same time. It's almost like money, but a little bit thicker. And this is the thing, in the intro to the video, when I said the word biomimetic suspension system, this is essentially what Bowers & Wilkins replaced in the 800, and I believe they have it in the 700 series speakers now, because this material moves back and forth because of the fact that it's an accordion style material just as much as your woofer cone does. And their research or whatever, they decided that it would be very important to replace that with something else, because they don't want this moving back and forth creating waves that are going to hit the back of your speaker cone and cause interference and stuff like that. So instead of it being a full spider that goes all the way around and is one big continuous piece, essentially, I'll put up some images, but the reason they call it biomimetic is because they're actually making it more like an actual spider, where I believe there's just like 8 parts that come out, 8 little arms that come out, and they connect to the voice coil, and then they go out and connect to the basket. And instead of being just one big piece that's moving back and forth just like your speaker cone, you just have these little pieces that are going to create less interference. At least that's the theory. But I mean, I did hear the 801s, but the Abbey Road edition speakers, and they sounded phenomenally transparent. So I'm not going to try to question Bowers & Wilkins' R&D department, because, you know, they're definitely doing something right. But yeah, that is now a totally destroyed speaker, but sorry I did the bait and switch on you. I was not going to do that to, you know, a really nice functioning speaker that I have been using daily in my bedroom system. So hopefully that clarifies some things for you guys. If you have any other questions, or if you want to make a request for like, how does this work? Explain this to me. I mean, I'm not a genius. I don't know literally everything, but I can try to make a video on the subject. Even though it's just junk, it still makes me sad that I tore the speaker apart. So if you guys like this video and you want to see reviews and stuff like that for other speakers as they're coming out and I can get my hands on them, make sure you like and subscribe to the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.